Why is the prime minister of a major NATO country personally inspecting some damaged railroad tracks? And what does it mean for not just NATO's security, but the direction of the entire Ukraine war? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. If you wear body armor, you already know not all plates are created equal. Today's sponsor, RMA Armament, isn't some Chinese drop shipper. It's not a rebrand of some manufactured overseas armor. It's American-made armor, made by people who know what it means to put your life behind it. The founder is a Marine Corps vet and former law enforcement officer who named the company after his kids because, as we know, the whole point of body armor is to get you home safe to your family. They've been making armor for over a decade now in a 30,000 square foot facility in Iowa using American-made materials and 100% American labor. I actually picked up their XRT plate in the Sappy cut. You notice this is thinner than anything I was issued by the US military in Afghanistan and significantly lighter. But the best part is that this, despite being so much lighter, is rated against almost every mid-size cartridge, almost every full-size standard issue rifle round, and even some armor-piercing rounds. It's made of ceramic, so you're not going to have to worry about spall, and it's available in shooter's cut and Sappy. RMA has body armor from level 3 soft armor all the way up to level 4 rated plates. Bottom line, RMA is doing it right. An American company, American made, built by people who understand what it means to put your life behind your body armor. So hit the link in the description, check out the catalog and videos. They've got some sales, and see why RMA is called the King of Armor. So, reportedly, a train is derailed in Poland. Nothing exceptional here. Train accidents happen all the time. But the Polish intelligence seem to think it's a little bit more than that. You see, the rail system in Poland isn't just some old rail system. Clearly, it's been deliberately damaged. There's not really any explanation for why it would be so cleanly cut away in one specific spot. But most importantly is what this train is. You see, this train services the Dorohsk-Yadin border and traverses Reznow, a logistics hub channeling NATO military aid to Ukrainian forces. This corridor is a high-value target for Russia's documented campaign to disrupt Western support for Ukraine's defenses. Now, the Polish police officially say they don't have an exact cause of what happened, but the fact is that someone has targeted a rail line that specifically moves goods from military assistance from Poland into Ukraine. But that's why the prime minister of the Poland is literally at that train station. He says, quote, "That's for sure. We are dealing with an act of diversion," which again, better translated as sabotage. You can see him and some of his key staff here with the police and army sizing up just what exactly happened and who did it. Now, this has all the hallmarks of a Russian hybrid operation. And the reason is because Russia has been on a hybrid campaign against NATO. We in the West have this idea of war and not war, and that if you trigger war, you mobilize entirely against a threat. But Russia doesn't operate that way. See, it sees war as just a continuation of political action. And so Russia defines the concept of its hybrid wars as just a subtype of war, like a counterinsurgency, rather than a set of means to conduct state policy, the way the U.S. does, saying, oh, well, if the CIA assassinating a terrorist in Somalia, it doesn't mean that the United States is at war with Somalia. Russia simply says, well, we are at something with this group of people, something war-like or in conflict, right? Russian armed forces openly refer to these kinds of conflicts as hybrid wars. Russia sees hybrid war as the future of military development. And this is something that is true. We've talked about extensively that to the West, a YouTuber, right? Or even the people that donate to, fundraising campaigns for Ukraine against Russia. Those individuals, we're like, well, they're non-combatants, right? But to Russia, we're all versions of combatants. We're all shades of combatant, right? From a Ukrainian infantryman in a house in Pokrovsk all the way over to Western politicians, all the way over to just Western supporters. Even if you have a social media account, a Twitter, an X, a TikTok account where you post pro-Ukraine content, you will definitely find yourself targeted by Russian hybrid war. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to have an FPV drone arrive at your house, but what it will mean is that you're going to see some level of Russian response, likely an automated bot response in your comments. And that is why this sort of minor action, right? The disruption of a rail line, literally, this looks like it was done with a portable acetylene torch, basically, something you could buy at a hardware store for less than $100. And as you can see, it's likely disrupted probably for up to a day. The logistics, hundreds of tons of logistics going into Ukraine. Now, this isn't the only operation, right? To Russia, influence operations targeting politicians are equally productive. And what I want to point out here is that here's photos revealing that German politicians, right, deputies, members of parliament, met in Moscow with sanctioned Russian influence network organizers, right? This is two members of European Parliament from Sarah Wagenknecht's ultra-left German party, BSW, actually went to Moscow, met with organizers of an organization called Voice of Europe. This is a sanctioned Russian influence network that really has is backed by essentially pro-Russian and pro-Russian Ukrainians, right? This is Voice of Europe is explicitly funded to spread pro-Russian messaging into Europe using Russian money. Now, there are reasons to believe Russia paid for this trip, and politicians reportedly said they paid for the journey themselves, but they were officially invited by so-called Russian Peace Foundation, which, according to investigative journalists, regularly passes personal data of its guests to the GUR. So again, if you're a German politician and you get invited to Russia, FYI, there is no scenario where they don't attempt to get some blackmail type of material on you. Now, I think this is troubling for a bunch of reasons, right? But you can see BSW has, the party has been called, quote, Germany's Putin friend due to repeated pro-Russian statements. She demanded removing Ukraine's NATO membership prospects from the agenda and called for a referendum on Germany in Germany on providing Ukraine with Taurus cruise missiles. So you can see what's fascinating, what I love about this stuff that's so helpful is that it actually, when we have these really distinct connections, when we can draw from an individual, a seemingly unconnected individual, and prove that they are funded by Russian GUR or Russian propagandists, what that allows us to do is triangulate the current Russian talking points, because Russian talking points are always changing just because, again, the truth, according to the Kremlin, is always changing. So we can see that there isn't really much of a legitimate reason to say, oh, Ukraine shouldn't become a NATO member. That's dumb. Montenegro's a NATO member, right? And those that say otherwise are at least advertently or inadvertently repeating Russian talking points. There's also saying that, oh, there needs to be a referendum in Germany on providing Ukraine with Taurus missiles. This is a fairly minor policy decision, something that does not require a referendum. Imagine if every single brigade, battalion, weapon sale required a national referendum. It'd be absurd. It would make foreign policy untenable, right? So I think this is just fascinating to me for a bunch of reasons, but the least of which is that we in the West are still laboring under this delusion that Russia is a non-threat, when Russia itself has made eminently clear in repeated statements and repeated actions that they view NATO and Western countries as their enemy, that they need to work to destroy their enemy, to demoralize their enemy, to prevent their enemy from taking actions that block Russia's ultimate objectives. And it's one of the things I think is so interesting about the era of social media is that, we look at Russia's objectives in Ukraine, we say, and we can point on a map and go Pokrovsk. They're trying to take the town of Pokrovsk. But that's not really what they're trying to do, right? That is a tactical objective. But there are equally important tactical objectives that Russia holds to achieve its strategic objectives, which is the vassalization of Ukraine and a larger vassalization of NATO, or maybe not vassalization, but more like obtaining a de facto veto on NATO actions. So again, Russia's goal is to create a Ukraine where Russia has a veto over the military, diplomatic, and economic actions of Ukraine, right? So if Ukraine wants to join any international organization, Russia has a veto, i.e. Russia gets to say if Ukraine is maintaining its neutrality or not. And this, I think, is just a reflection. We in the West, we think that Russia, well, they're not at war with us, they're at war with someone else. But that's not what Russia says. Putin himself has come out and said, I want to see NATO eliminated. Putin has said, I'm at war with NATO. Again, the best analogy that I can give you is that it's the equivalent of putting on boxing gloves, getting brought to a ring, being put into the ring, right? The bell rings, and maintaining that you're not in a boxing fight. Like at some point, the West has to look around and go, guys, I think we are actually in a boxing match. And again, the West bills itself as the biggest, toughest, baddest boxer in the world. But if they don't ever realize they're in a fight, they're going to get knocked out. It's just, look at how many UFC fighters or famous boxers. Actually, it's a real problem for them that people at clubs, at parties will get drunk and they'll say, man, I'm gonna knock out that UFC fighter. And they can, despite the fact that the UFC fighter is bigger, better trained, stronger. If you sucker punch them, if they don't realize they're in a fight, they can lose just as easily as anybody. And so that's the danger. That's the strategy of the Russian armed forces, is to create enough propaganda screening by the politicians within their own countries, within Germany, within Poland, within the United States, to create enough confusion and paralysis within these systems. And not just politicians, by the way, the public as well. They want to paralyze the actual public to make them think that, well, maybe Ukraine should be neutral, but who gets to decide if something is neutral? Wait. Russia? Well, then it's not really neutral. It's just a big brother system. So the fact is that, like, Russia believes it's in an all-out fight. And it's only the West who simply is self-restraining itself and is going to end up crumpled on the floor, not even realizing that the war already happened, right? That's the fear. And you're like, well, how could that be? Well, as we've pointed out, guys, if Russia can mass its troops on the Baltics, outside the Baltics, and tell the Baltics, listen, I don't care what you say about being in NATO. They're not going to back you up. You are going to sign these agreements. You're going to remove NATO troops from your country. You are going to allow Russian-backed political parties to enter your system. You're going to sign these very narrow agreements with Russia. And the Baltics go, well, you can't bully us like that. We're NATO members. And they turn to NATO, and NATO goes, well, Germany goes, well, we don't really have the political capital to deploy troops to help you out, Baltics. And the UK goes, well, it's controversial, so we're going to condemn the Russian military buildup, but maybe we'll send you some gear. And the United States goes, oh, well, we're America first. And that means that we don't help our friends anymore. So, while we'll be disappointed if Russia invades and we'll make a firmly worded statement, that's the limits of our support. And then they go, oh, that NATO treaty, there's no recourse. If they say, well, we are supporting you, we condemned Russia's actions. That's our support. We're giving you diplomatic and political support. There's nothing in the NATO treaty that can force. There's no forcing function. The treaty is only as strong as the members within it. And Russia knows this. So by engaging in this broad swath of disruption activities, this broad swath, both low-level disruption activities and this campaign of political influence, and, by the way, popular influence, what you end up with is a hybrid war system in which Russia can achieve a victory, a military victory over NATO countries with minimal actual war fighting. That was the goal in Ukraine. But the 2022 invasion was just supposed to be the capstone of a systematic Russian effort to infiltrate, paralyze, and cripple the Ukrainian government's decision-making ability. The only problem is that, well, the Ukrainians and to an extent the Western allies worked to build systems that were somewhat resilient to Russian corruption. And that's why when the time came, the Ukrainians were actually able to fight and even win. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thanks so much. Thanks to today's sponsor, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.